Can you see how much of a disaster my room is? No? Okay. It's fine. It's fine. So, welcome back to my channel. As you can tell, I'm in a new room. I moved. I'm really hoping to get it set up where I can get my like big fancy wall of stuff behind me. But I'm feeling real lazy and I don't want to figure out how many books I need to stack my phone on in order for you to be able to see my face. And I would use my laptop, but the audio quality on my laptop, the mic is kind of weird, especially with like P's and S's for some reason. So I'd much rather record on my phone. There'll probably be a bunch of different backgrounds for the next couple of videos until I figure out what I'm doing with this space. I just finished reading Heart-Shaped Box by Joe Hill, and that's the first book that I have ever read by him. I've read just under 20 Stephen King books, I think. It's actually kind of funny because when I was like 12 or 13, I really wanted to get into horror and I wanted to start reading more horror novels. And I actually stumbled across 20th Century Ghosts by Joe Hill. And my mom reached out to my aunt, who's a massive Stephen King fan, and was like, have you read these books? Like, I think she was worried it would be like too adult for me. I think she was less worried about it being too scary because I was a very difficult child to scare, but more about like the adult content that would be in the books. And my aunt said that she thought that Joe Hill's books were a little bit more graphic than Stephen King's, so she recommended that I actually start with Stephen King and then maybe when I was older go back to Joe Hill. And then I just got hooked on Stephen King and never bothered to go back. But here we are, 8-ish years later, and I've actually gone back and read the book. I'm sure it's probably annoying as hell for him to get compared to his father all the time, but we're just gonna do it anyways because content. So having read about almost 20 Stephen King novels, I feel like I have a pretty good grip on like some of the tropes and things that he uses over and over again. And there's definitely some of these things that I see crop up in Joe Hill's novels, which I wouldn't be surprised if those were inspired by things that he learned from his dad. So I thought it would be interesting to kind of compare and contrast some of those things between the different books, so that's just kind of what I'm going to do, and I'll probably give a little bit of a review of Heart-Shaped Box as I go along. So just as a beginner English, just as an introduction to Heart-Shaped Box, it essentially follows this washed up rock star, Jude Kane, one of those things when you like try to talk about the book and you realize you don't know how to pronounce the characters' names. So he's a washed-up rock star of a heavy metal band, so he's very into like kind of the occult ideas that often get put in with heavy metal bands. It also means he's a collector of these really bizarre things that have to kind of do with like the occult or supernatural. And his lawyer finds this eBay ad for a ghost online, and he tells him to buy it, and it's essentially this suit, and then it turns out the ghost has a little bit more of a connection to him than he originally thought, and actually has a vendetta against him, and then things, of course, spiral out of control, as they like to in horror novels. What did you expect? I gave the book 3.5 stars, just as a little bit of an introduction to it. I had issues with the ending. I've talked about this on my channel before. I think I'm a complete cynic because I have problems if the endings are too perfect, and that is very much how I felt the ending of this book was. One of my favorite things about Stephen King novels is that he doesn't shy away from unhappy endings. One of the first books that I ever read by him was Cujo. If you haven't read that book, I won't spoil it, but there is like there's a very traumatic ending, and a lot of people didn't think it was going to end that way, so much so to the point that they changed the ending for the movie to try and make it a little bit more palatable. But I loved the realism of it, and I loved that they didn't try and like dress it up as something that it wasn't. And I think that's what I found at the end of Heart-Shaped Box, was Joe Hill was trying to like give you everything in a pretty little bow, and I was like, this doesn't fit for the characters or for the story at all, and it felt very forced to me. So I guess that's one thing that I found was he was a little bit less likely to take some of those leaps and just like cause major character death or trauma or things like that. Far more unlikely to do that in this book than Stephen King is in some of the novels that I've read by him. Other thoughts on the books, similarities that I've noticed between the two of them. They both have like weird descriptions of like sexual things that are not necessary in the book. The first one that always comes to mind with me for Stephen King is that section of it that no one talks about and doesn't need to be there and is just creepy and uncomfortable. But I also think that in Heart-Shaped Box there was definitely times where they were like talking about things about Georgia, who's the main character's girlfriend, that didn't need to be talked about, or there were comparisons that were being made that like didn't need to be made. Like someone's getting possessed and they compare it to an orgasm, and I'm like, this does not, please stop. I don't want to read about this. I don't want to know about this. I don't have a problem with like explicit sexual content as long as it like has a reason to be in the book. I hate when people just put it in to put it in. And I think I have read both Stephen King novels and Joe Hill books that done that. Like the whole thing about like senior citizen sex that exists in the Green Mile. I think it's like a one-off comment, but it just made me so uncomfortable when I read it, and I'm like, cool, I get this, I just don't need to visualize it or know it to understand the story and relate to the characters. So that was another commonality that I found. And I think the other one was side characters who are extreme caricatures. Stephen King in particular really likes to have characters that just swear nonstop for no reason. I'm thinking of like the taxi driver in It, the boiler repairman in The Shining. There's lots of other examples of these like side characters that are like so like they're caricatures. They're so exaggerated and like pulled apart to be like these like weird quirky personalities that they like almost don't seem like real people. They seem kind of like cartoon characters. And I felt like some of the bandmates that they talk about in Heart-Shaped Box were portrayed in much the same way. Particularly Dizzy was like, I didn't know anything about him except for the fact that he died from AIDS, and they just like kept bringing that back up, and I was like, cool, maybe I would have more of a connection to him if I like knew more about him. And they kind of became like these like extreme like washed out rock star caricatures in some ways that I think made it a little bit more difficult for me to connect to the book and also connect to the sense of loss that Jude had. And I think that's something else that I've noticed that is parallel between the two, but also something that I personally have connected to more in Stephen King novels than I have in this Joe Hill novel. And of course, I've only read one of Joe Hill's novels, so I don't think it's fair for me to make sweeping judgments on him when I haven't read a large portion of his literature. But I think it is the, I don't want to say deadbeat dad, but it's like the abusive parent. And of course my phone ran out of storage, but I think I fixed it. Just if the picture shifts, that's why. Yeah, so another thing that I've noticed is the kind of abusive parent is a recurring theme in both of their books. I think one of the issues that I really struggled with Joe Hill's book was I didn't relate to the characters enough because I didn't have enough of their background. We got like glimpses into these like really traumatic things that happened with Jude and his father, but I didn't get enough of them that I could connect to him. And I think part of that was because we had this glimpse of his life as a child, and then we had this glimpse of his like post rock stardom, and there was this huge gap in the middle of like development and character growth that the reader had no insight into. Whereas I think sometimes with books like Shining and Doctor Sleep, hello airplane, there was enough of a connection to the character and enough of a filling in of those gaps that I was able to stick with Danny like through the ages, even though there was like this massive age gap between the time of telling those two stories. So that was something that I like struggled with while I was reading, that I was like trying to wrap my head around a little bit, and I think it took me a little bit longer to get into Heart-Shaped Box because of that. And I think in general the character portrayal was just, I've just personally found the character portrayals to be stronger in Stephen King novels, which is really what helps pull me into them and like keep me rooting for the characters and like egging them forward. Something interesting that I haven't really taken a look at with Stephen King novels, but I think is something that, with my degree and stuff, is something that I need to consider more, is the portrayal of women. In Heart-Shaped Box, he's like this washed up rock star caricature, and of course, like, always sleeping with younger women. They're usually goths, and he often finds them as like hookers or strippers, or as like, what do they call those? Groupies? I promise I listen to 80s glam metal. I actually do. I'm very disappointed that I couldn't think of the word for groupies. But the point is that they fall into this like very narrow idea of what someone is, and they're drawing all these parallels throughout the story between his current girlfriend, Mary Beth slash Georgia, because he calls them all after the state that they're from, and his previous girlfriend, Anna, who is also referred to as Florida. And my problem was they just end up seeming too much like the same person in some ways, whereas even though they're supposed to be these like strong developed characters, particularly Mary Beth has a really difficult past and she has a lot that she's trying to grow through, they end up kind of filling this like damsel in distress role. And it was really aggravating for me, because I was kind of reading it and I was like, they come off as like so flat. And there were times in the book where, like, for example, they're in a Denny's and someone immediately makes that assumption that she's just with him because he's paying her. And I feel like they could have done a lot more with that, like pulled out some sort of conversation about how a lot of these girls that he's with have been like objectified and forced into these stereotypes for a really long time, and made it more of a story of like coming through that in the same way that Jude was trying to come through his trauma and his past in order to like become a new person. And I felt like her storyline just didn't exist with the same strength or importance as his did. And unfortunately, I think a lot of Stephen King books are very heavily male-led, and they often have a lot of strong male characters. Holly, who's been in a lot of the newer Stephen King books, is from the like Mr. Mercedes series. I don't know what the name of that series is called, and also showed up in The Outsider, is like an excellent female character, and a lot of his, I guess, children female characters like Bev and the main little girl from Firestarter are both like excellent examples of strong female character development. But I think unfortunately, like, I'm just thinking like reading The Outsider, besides Holly, it's like a predominantly male book, and a lot of his books focus on that, and the women are unfortunately not the greatest. Even in like The Shining, the portrayal of Wendy is pretty rough. It's not as bad as the film, but it's not great. That being said, I do think Stephen King has more strong like mother figure, like he kind of plays with the roles of females more and gives them more depth, particularly like the mom in Cujo is really interesting. The more I think about it, the more I can think of good examples, so now I'm feeling like this isn't a valid point. But I think it is a general criticism within horror as a genre, is so often we have this like male character who has some sort of trauma or history or connection to whatever is happening, and he has to get pulled through it, and he has a female love interest because they're all heteronormative, and she's the damsel in distress that gets dragged into it and doesn't really want to be there, and he has to do it not only to rescue himself but to rescue her as well. And it creates this really like, it creates a really negative narrative of what women can do and what their role is in literature. You often see this in horror films as well, where it's always some like dumb blonde teenager who's the first one to go off and get herself killed. So I think that's something that I found maybe I'm more aware of now that I'm studying it, and I haven't read as many Stephen King novels recently, but I do think that that's something that needs to be considered when looking at these books. I'm trying to think, there were some other things that I wanted to say. I think that generally wraps it up. So I'm just gonna go, I feel like this was kind of all over the place. I kind of like doing these videos where I just get to like sit down and blab about the books that I'm reading, If that's not a style that you're a fan of, please let me know. I'm more than willing to change up the way that I do these videos. I think in general what I wanted to say was they're good. Joe Hill's book was a good horror novel. It was well written, definitely has the family writing gift. I haven't read any Owen King yet, or anything by Stephen King's wife, but he's got the writing genes from the family. And I wouldn't not recommend the book, but I also did find it's funny because I would say he's not as strong in endings, even though Stephen King's one of his major critiques is the fact that his endings aren't great. I think his son suffered more with the fact that it felt too perfect. It felt like he was trying to wrap it all up in a bow. And I think his son could do more with character development. Oh, that's something else that I wanted to talk about really quickly, is the recovering addict story. Because Stephen King writes about a lot of recovering addicts or alcoholics or people who use drugs, and I think that is from his own personal experience. So as a result, it comes off as a very honest and true depiction. I'm particularly thinking of like a book like Dr. Sleep, where they do a wonderful job of like walking through those stages of recovery and the way that like recovery continues to be something that you have to work at. And in this book, he like was a recovered addict, but they just kind of like threw it in there, like, oh yeah, by the way, he used to do a bunch of cocaine, but he's fine now. And it wasn't, that part of his life didn't carry enough weight in the way that I felt that it should, and it felt like they were treating it as kind of like a tokenism thing of like being a rock star in that era of his life, without actually valuing the way that those experiences shape and define a person, which I think is another way that I found the disconnect between Jude as a child when he was still Justin and Jude as he was, and it was difficult to see them as the same person and draw those connections. So I would be very interested to read another Joe Hill book to see if he starts to fill in some of these gaps in his character developments and is able to make those stronger connections, because I think that would make the story itself more entertaining. Because a lot of the times when I was reading the book, the horror was picking up so fast that I was like, there's 200 pages left, what else is going to happen? And I didn't feel like I was emotionally invested in the characters enough that I was going to want to keep going, even if there was character development or things happening after they fought the big bad. So yeah, I wouldn't say I have a new favorite horror author, but I would definitely check out some of his other books. I've never read Horns, but I've heard a lot about it, and of course I feel like I should read 20th Century Ghosts, since that's the book that ended up leaving me to Stephen King anyhow. I'm in a bit of a horror mood, so I think I might read another couple books, which I will probably touch on more in my wrap-up video that I will do at the end of August. But in the meantime, sorry this was a little over the place. I like just kind of getting to brain dump. I've also been doing training, so my brain is like completely fried. I will try to rejig a better setup than whatever is going on right now. But until then, thank you for following. It's been so lovely to hear comments and feedback from all of you guys, so please hit the subscribe button, leave me a comment, let me know what you think of this video, what else you'd like to see, if there's ways you'd like me to change up how I do my format. I'm going to keep trying to post a video once a week. I'm not going to pick a day until I get into a little bit more of my schedule with my new job and school and everything. But in the meantime, if you want to follow me, I will link my Goodreads, my blog, which I also have to deal with, and my Instagram down below. And I will see you all next week.